I can't pinpoint the exact moment when things began to spiral out of control. Maybe it was a few years ago, or maybe it was more gradual, creeping up on us until we couldn't see what was happening anymore. My wife, Natalie, and I used to have something special. We were the couple everyone envied: good jobs, a nice house, no kids to complicate things. I worked as a software engineer for a startup in the city, while Natalie held a managerial position at a high-end fashion boutique. On paper, we had everything. But something was off. It wasn't always like this. When we first met, Natalie was vibrant, full of life, and we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Weekends were spent on spontaneous road trips, nights full of laughter, and making love till the early hours. It felt like we were partners in every sense of the word, emotionally, physically, even spiritually. But then, life happened. Work got busier, stress piled on, and somewhere along the way, we stopped looking at each other the same. I first noticed the shift a little over 2 years ago. Natalie became more distant. At first, I thought it was just work stress. Her boutique had expanded, and she was under pressure to perform. She'd come home late, claiming there had been meetings or some last-minute orders to fulfill. I didn't think much of it at the time. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? We had always been honest with each other, at least. That's what I believed. There were little things that started nagging at me, though. Natalie began taking longer to get ready for seemingly ordinary days, as if she was preparing for someone other than me. She'd spend hours at the salon, come home looking stunning, and then nothing. No desire to spend time together, no lingering kisses or playful teasing like before. She seemed elsewhere. One evening I got home earlier than usual and found her sitting on the couch, dressed in this sleek black dress I hadn't seen before. Her phone was in her hand, and as soon as she noticed me, she quickly tucked it away into her purse. It was a small action, barely noticeable, but my gut churned. I asked her about the dress, and she brushed it off, saying it was just something new from the store. Something didn't feel right. I should have paid more attention then. I should have asked more questions. But instead, I brushed off that gnawing feeling in my gut. I wanted to believe everything was fine. I wanted to believe the woman I married was still the same person. Work was my distraction. The hours were long, the pressure intense, and it was easy to lose myself in code and algorithms rather than confront what was unraveling in front of me. But in the quiet moments, when I'd lie next to Natalie in bed, staring at the ceiling while she faced the other way, I knew something had shifted between us. There were more strange moments. She started going out more frequently, meeting up with her friend Ella, who had always struck me as wild. Ella was the kind of person who thrived on chaos, always looking for the next party, the next thrill. Natalie would come back from these outings smelling of alcohol and cigarettes, her eyes glossy and distant. I asked her once if everything was okay. She just smiled and said I was being paranoid, that Ella was a bad influence but harmless. "Come with me next time," she had said, laughing it off. "You'll see, we just drink and dance, that's all." But she never pushed it. In fact, she seemed relieved when I declined. I told myself it was nothing. Natalie deserved to have fun, didn't she? Maybe Ella was just her outlet, a way to let loose after a long day of managing a boutique. I tried not to be the jealous, overbearing husband, but late at night, when she would come home smelling like someone else's cologne, I'd lie awake, staring into the darkness, trying to suppress the rising doubt. Then, about 6 months ago, things took a turn. I remember that night vividly. Natalie had come home even later than usual, her hair tousled, her lipstick smudged. She looked at me with this guilty expression only for a second, but quickly masked it with a laugh. "Ella dragged me to this ridiculous party," she had said. "It was a disaster. You wouldn't believe the kind of people who show up at these things." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But something about the way she spoke, the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, it felt like a lie. We went to bed that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the echoes of her laugh, the tremble in her voice when she said it was just a party. I told myself I was imagining things, but my mind wouldn't let it go. And that's when I made my first mistake. I checked her phone. I didn't want to. I felt sick as I picked it up from her bedside table, careful not to wake her. My heart pounded in my chest as I swiped through her messages. Nothing. She was smart, too smart to leave anything obvious lying around. But there was one name that kept coming up in her text: Nick. I didn't recognize the name, and the messages were vague, just a few exchanges about meeting up or planning something. It could have been nothing. A colleague, a friend. But why wouldn't she mention him to me? Why keep him a secret? I put the phone down and tried to calm myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Nick was just someone from work or Della's friend. But my gut, the one thing I had learned to trust over the years, told me otherwise. And so, the doubt began to consume me. After that night, everything changed. Or maybe it had already changed, and I was only just noticing. I started paying more attention to Natalie, the way she'd glance at her phone during dinner, the sudden late-night texts, the way she seemed so distracted. Then she became more secretive, more guarded. If I asked where she was going, she'd give me these vague answers like, Oh, just meeting Ella for a drink, or I have to run to the boutique. Something came up, but the excuses didn't add up. There were too many late nights, too many mysterious phone calls. One Saturday morning, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. My heart raced as I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Nick. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't my imagination running wild. It was real. That was the moment I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that my wife was cheating on me. I stood there, staring at her phone, my mind spinning. The words on the screen hit me like a freight train. "Last night was amazing." My throat tightened as the reality of it sank in. This was no harmless outing with Ella. There was someone else. Nick wasn't just a name in her phone. He was real. He had been with my wife, and the way he said it, it wasn't innocent. Natalie's voice, singing softly in the shower, barely reached me as I stood frozen in place. I knew I should have been angry, raging, but all I felt in that moment was a deep, hollow emptiness. It was like the ground had fallen out from under me, and I was just standing there, suspended there, waiting for the crash. The water shut off in the bathroom, and panic set in. I quickly set the phone back down, placing it exactly where it had been. I couldn't face her, not yet. I couldn't let her know I had seen it, not until I had a plan. I walked out of the bedroom, heart pounding, and headed downstairs to the kitchen. I needed to think, needed to breathe, but it was like my mind had gone numb. All I could picture was Natalie with him, Nick, whoever the hell he was. The image of them together burned into my thoughts like a brand, and I couldn't shake it. A few minutes later, Natalie came down, wrapped in a towel, her damp hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She smiled at me, that same smile she had always given, but now it felt forced, hollow. I couldn't see the woman I once loved in her eyes anymore. All I could see was the betrayal. "What's for breakfast?" she asked casually, walking over to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Nothing yet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Normal. Was thinking of making some eggs." "Sounds good," she said, glancing at her phone as it buzzed again. Her face didn't change, didn't betray a single thing as she read the message, then quickly tucked the phone into her pocket. I wondered how long she had been doing this, how many lies she had told, how many times she had gone to bed next to me, pretending everything was fine. I wanted to ask her, wanted to scream at her, but I held back. I needed to figure out how far this had gone. I needed proof before I confronted her. Natalie chatted about her plans for the day, another brunch with Ella, another evening meeting for the boutique, but I wasn't listening. My mind was somewhere else, imagining her sneaking off with him, meeting him somewhere I wasn't. What had started as suspicion now became a full-blown obsession. Every time she left the house, every time her phone buzzed, I wondered if it was him. I wondered if she was thinking about him while she was with me. That night, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I ever thought I would do. I hated the idea of playing detective in my own marriage, of stalking my own wife like some jealous fool, but I needed to know. I couldn't live in this limbo of doubt any longer. She left around 8 p.m., dressed in that same black dress she had worn the night I found her sitting on the couch. Her perfume hung in the air after she kissed me on the cheek, a kiss that felt like nothing more than habit. I waited for her to pull out of the driveway before grabbing my keys and following a few minutes behind. My heart pounded the whole way, my palms slick against the steering wheel. I didn't know what I expected to find. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe it really was just a girls' night out, that I'd catch her in some restaurant laughing with Ella, no harm done. But deep down, I knew better. I kept my distance, tailing her car through the city, watching as she turned off the main road and into a quieter, more residential area. This wasn't the way to Ella's place, or any restaurant I knew. My stomach twisted as I watched her pull into a driveway in front of a modest house. She stepped out of the car, glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was watching, and then walked to the front door. That's when I saw him. Nick. He stepped out of the house, grinning as he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her in for a kiss. It wasn't a peck on the cheek or a friendly hug. It was passionate, intimate, the kind of kiss that used to be mine. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. There it was, right in front of me. Proof my wife was cheating on me. There was no denying it now. I wanted to storm out of the car, to confront them, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the cold realization that my marriage was already dead, but I just sat there, watching them disappear inside together. For a long time I stayed in the car, staring at the house, my mind blank. I couldn't believe this was happening, that the woman I had built a life with, had loved so deeply, was capable of this. Every memory we had together, every promise she had made, felt like a lie. I had been living in a fantasy, blind to the truth right in front of me. Eventually I drove home, my mind spinning with thoughts of what to do next. I couldn't confront her yet, not without a plan. I knew I had to play this smart. Natalie wasn't just cheating on me, she was deceiving me, and I needed to figure out just how deep this betrayal ran. When she came home later that night, she acted as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just spent the evening in another man's arms. I watched her closely, trying to decipher every move, every word, but she was too good. She smiled, kissed me goodnight, and climbed into bed like it was just another ordinary day. But nothing about this was ordinary, not anymore. The next morning, I called my lawyer. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old wood, the kind of place where serious decisions were made. I sat there, tapping my fingers against the arm of the chair, waiting for him to finish skimming through the documents I'd brought. James, my lawyer, was an older guy, grizzled, no nonsense, the kind of man who didn't mince words, and that's exactly what I needed. "So, you're certain?" he asked, leaning back and adjusting his glasses, his tone calm, professional. I nodded, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. I followed her, saw it with my own eyes. She's been seeing this guy. Nick, the name, felt bitter on my tongue. Even just saying it made me want to punch something. James didn't flinch. He'd probably heard it all before. "All right," he said, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "You want to confront her, or do you want to wait until we've got more?" "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "Part of me wants to just blow this whole thing up, throw it in her face, and watch her crumble. But the other part of me, I don't know. James, the first one to make sure she doesn't walk away with everything. She's been lying to me for God knows how long. I want to protect myself." James nodded thoughtfully. "Smart, you're thinking long term. That's good. Here's what we'll do if you're not ready to confront her yet. We can gather more evidence, get a PI involved, maybe even follow the money trail. If she's hiding anything else, we'll find it." I agreed, even though part of me itched to get it over with. I wanted the truth out in the open, but I also knew that if I acted rashly, she could twist this around and leave me with nothing but regret. I needed to be careful, calculated, just like she had been. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I hired a private investigator to follow Natalie, to track her movements and see just how deep this thing with Nick went. I stopped asking her where she was going, stopped questioning her late nights and sudden disappearances. If she noticed, she didn't let on. She seemed more comfortable now, more relaxed, like she had me completely fooled. But I wasn't fooled. I was waiting. The PI's reports came in weekly. Photos of Natalie and Nick meeting up, at bars, at his house, even sneaking away to hotels. It was all there, undeniable, irrefutable proof. The worst part wasn't even seeing her with him. No, the worst part was seeing how happy she looked. She was laughing, smiling, holding his hand like he was the one who made her whole. It twisted the knife in my gut deeper with each photo I saw. I tried to keep my composure, tried to act normal at home, but it was getting harder by the day. Every time she looked at me, I saw her with him. Every time she kissed me goodnight, I imagined her lips on his. My patience was running thin. Then came the night that everything fell apart. It was a Friday, and Natalie had told me she'd be working late. Of course, I knew better by now. The PI had already tipped me off she and Nick were going to some party, a low-key event hosted by her friend Ella. From what the investigator had found out, Ella wasn't exactly known for keeping things classy. The party would be full of alcohol, drugs, and God knows what else. I sat at home, staring at my phone, contemplating my next move. Natalie hadn't even bothered to text me. She was probably too busy with him to even pretend anymore. I could feel the anger building inside me, the resentment that had been boiling for months now, ready to spill over. That's when I got the call from Misty. Misty had been a friend of ours for a long time, married to another guy in our social circle. I hadn't seen her much lately, but I knew she and her husband had been having problems. Rumor had it that her husband had been cheating on her for months. Guess who he'd been cheating with? Yeah, Natalie. Misty's voice was shaky on the other end of the line. "John," she said, and I could tell she was trying to hold back tears. "I'm at the party. You need to come. You need to see this for yourself." I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys and left. The drive to Ella's place felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes away. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The rage was building, like a dam ready to break. By the time I pulled up to the house, I was barely holding it together. The music was loud, the bass thumping through the walls as I walked up to the door. I could already tell it was one of those parties, people stumbling around drunk, some making out in corners, others lost in their own little worlds. This wasn't Natalie's scene, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. I pushed my way through the crowd, looking for Misty, when I saw her. Natalie. She was sitting on a couch, laughing, a drink in her hand. And there, right next to her, was Nick, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. They looked like a couple, comfortable, happy, in their own bubble of infidelity. The room spun for a moment, and I had to steady myself. This was it. The moment of truth. All the lies, all the betrayal. It was staring me right in the face. Misty appeared next to me, her eyes red from crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know until recently. I couldn't let you keep living in the dark." I nodded, my eyes locked on Natalie and Nick, who hadn't noticed me yet. "Thanks," I muttered, though my voice barely sounded like my own. It was like I was watching this happen from outside my own body, like it wasn't real. But it was. I walked toward them, the noise of the party fading into the background as my heart hammered in my chest. Natalie glanced up, her smile faltering when she saw me. For a moment she looked panicked, like a deer caught in headlights. "John," she said, her voice laced with surprise, "what are you doing here?" Nick shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly not expecting this confrontation. He glanced at Natalie, then back at me, his face tight with tension. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring at the two of them, letting the silence stretch out, letting them feel the weight of what they had done. Then, slowly I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the stack of papers. Divorce papers. "I'm here to give you this," I said, my voice cold and steady. I held the papers out to her, watching her expression change from confusion to shock, then to something that almost resembled fear. She didn't reach for them. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. What is this?" she stammered, as if she didn't already know. "You're served," Misty said, stepping forward, her voice hard. "Ironic, isn't it? You helped destroy my marriage, and now yours is going down the same way." Natalie's face drained of color. "John, please." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharp. "Don't say a damn word. It's over, Natalie. I know about everything. The lies, the cheating, all of it. You think you've been smart, keeping me in the dark, but I've known for a while now. I was just waiting for the right moment." Her lips trembled as she stood up, her eyes darting around the room, as if she was looking for a way out, but there was none. She was caught, and she knew it. Nick, for his part, stayed silent. He wasn't going to fight for her. Of course he wasn't. This was probably just a fling to him, something to pass the time. But to me, it was everything. This was my life she had ripped apart. Natalie reached for my arm, her touch light and desperate. "John, please. Let's talk about this. We can fix it. It doesn't have to end like this." I pulled away, my voice cold and final. "It already has." Natalie stood there, her hand still hanging in the air where I had pulled away from her touch, as if the reality of the situation hadn't yet sunk in. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, trembling like a child caught in a lie too big to handle. For the first time I could see the cracks forming in the confident facade she had been wearing for months. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, her voice shaky, desperate now. "We can work through this, John. It's not what you think." I scoffed, feeling a cold wave of anger surge through me. "Not what I think? Natalie, I followed you. I saw you with him." I jabbed a finger in Nick's direction, who was doing his best to shrink into the background, avoiding eye contact. "I've been watching you for weeks. You've lied to my face, you've snuck around behind my back, and now you want me to believe it's not what I think." Her eyes flitted nervously around the room, taking in the people who had stopped to watch. Whispers were spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Ella, the so-called friend who had orchestrated most of these sordid nights, stood in the corner, arms crossed, smirking like none of this surprised her. In fact, she looked entertained, like she thrived on this kind of drama. I could see the panic rise in Natalie's face, but what surprised me most was that it wasn't because she had hurt me. No, she was panicking because she was losing control of the narrative. She had always been good at controlling the situation, at manipulating emotions, but now she was exposed. Naked in front of everyone with no more lies to hide behind. "John, please," her voice cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek. She reached for me again, this time more urgently. "I made a mistake. Mistake," I snapped, stepping back from her. "Sleeping with him, sneaking around for months, that's not a mistake, Natalie. That's a choice. You chose this. You chose to destroy us." Nick, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of him, shifted awkwardly beside her. His eyes flicked to the door, like he was planning an escape. "Look, man, I didn't." "Shut up," I said, cutting him off sharply. "This isn't about you. It's about her." I pointed to Natalie, feeling the anger bubbling up again. "You were just the convenient asshole she chose to cheat with." Nick held up his hands defensively, clearly not wanting any part of the confrontation. I didn't care about him. He was just another piece of the puzzle, a pawn in the game she had been playing. But Natalie, she had orchestrated this whole thing, and now she was watching it crumble around her. Her tears were flowing more freely now, but they didn't affect me, not like they used to. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she sobbed, her voice cracking with every word. It just got out of control. I was so stressed, and I..." "Stop," I said, my voice cold, emotionless. "Don't try to spin this into something it's not. You didn't care about me. You didn't care about our marriage. You only cared about yourself." The truth was sharp, cutting through whatever remnants of sympathy I might have still had for her. She wiped at her face, her mascara smearing as the weight of what she had done settled in. I could see the realization dawn on her. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. There was no fixing it. The marriage was over, and I had made my decision. The room was deathly silent, all eyes on us as I handed her the divorce papers again. She stared at them, like the words on the page were too painful to comprehend. Misty, standing beside me with an air of calm detachment, folded her arms and gave a small, bitter smile. "This is what you deserve," Misty said quietly, but with steel in her voice. She hadn't come here for a show, she had come here for justice. Natalie had not only betrayed me, but she had also played a role in the destruction of Misty's marriage. There was a twisted symmetry in that. I didn't have anything left to say to Natalie. The rage I had carried for weeks had finally dissipated, leaving behind only a cold, hollow emptiness. I was done. The trust had been shattered long ago, and there was nothing left to salvage. I turned to leave, my heart heavy but resolute. As I moved toward the door, I heard Natalie's voice behind me, small and broken. "John, please, don't do this." But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The fallout from that night rippled through our lives like an earthquake. The divorce process began immediately. James had done an excellent job of securing my assets, and with the evidence I had gathered, there wasn't much Natalie could argue with. She tried to delay it, of course, begging me to reconsider, but the damage was done. I found out more during the proceedings, more than I had ever wanted to know. Natalie's affair with Nick hadn't been some spur-of-the-moment thing. It had been going on for months, carefully orchestrated behind my back, with Ella covering for her at every turn. Natalie had used work as an excuse, had lied about nearly everything. She had even gone as far as withdrawing money from our joint accounts to finance her secret life. The betrayal cut deeper every day as more layers of her deceit were revealed. I threw myself into work, trying to stay distracted from the mess my life had become. The house, once filled with memories of happier times, now felt empty, hollow. I packed up her things, leaving them in boxes by the door for her to collect. The thought of her touching anything that had once been ours made my skin crawl. Misty and I began to talk more after that night. At first, it was just to commiserate, to vent our frustrations about the mess our lives had become. But over time, something deeper grew between us. We shared the same pain, the same sense of betrayal, and that connection slowly evolved into something more. It wasn't long before we started spending more time together: dinners, long talks, quiet nights where we could both find solace in each other's company. She understood what I was going through in a way no one else could, and somehow, through all the wreckage, we found comfort in each other. Months passed, and by the time the divorce was finalized, Natalie was a ghost from my past. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I didn't care where she went or what she did after that. The chapter was closed. It was New Year's Eve when everything truly came full circle. Misty and I had been invited to a party, a much more upscale, relaxed affair than the one where everything had unraveled. We mingled with friends, drank champagne, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was happy. As midnight approached, I found myself standing with Misty under the soft glow of twinkling lights. The countdown began, and as everyone cheered the arrival of the new year, I pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. In that moment I knew that Misty wasn't just someone I had found in the wreckage of my past. She was my future. I reached into my pocket, my heart pounding not with fear, but with hope. "Misty," I said, my voice barely audible over the noise of the celebration, "I know this might be crazy, but will you marry me?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might be too shocked to answer, but then she smiled, really smiled, and nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." As I slipped the ring onto her finger, the world around us erupted in cheers, fireworks lighting up the sky. I kissed her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened lift from my shoulders. It wasn't perfect, and it hadn't been easy, but somehow, through all the betrayal and heartbreak, I had found my way to something real, something true. Across the room, standing by herself in the shadows, was Natalie. She watched us, her face unreadable, as the realization of her choices settled in. She had destroyed everything we once had, and now she was nothing more than a spectator in my life. The life she could have had, the love she had thrown away, it was gone. And I wasn't looking back. Natalie stood in the corner of the room, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Her presence felt like a shadow, a ghost haunting the edge of my happiness. I hadn't noticed her at first, too caught up in the warmth of Misty's embrace, too lost in the joy of that perfect moment. But as the fireworks faded and the crowd's cheers subsided into laughter and conversation, I saw her. She was watching me. I hadn't thought about what it would feel like to see Natalie again, not really. Not after everything. I hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't prepared for the sudden flood of memories that came rushing back as our eyes briefly met across the room. For a moment I almost felt something: nostalgia, maybe, regret? But whatever it was fleeting. A whisper of what once was, now completely overshadowed by the reality of what she had done. Misty was still at my side, her fingers entwined with mine, and the ring I'd just given her glinted softly under the twinkling lights. She was talking to someone, a friend, I think, but all I could hear was the steady thrum of my heartbeat as I locked eyes with Natalie. I could tell she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected me to move on. Maybe she thought she still held some power over me, some lingering influence. But in that moment, I knew she understood the truth. She wasn't the center of my world anymore. I wasn't hers to manipulate or betray. She had lost me, and there was no going back. Her face was pale, her eyes dull and tired, the same eyes that once sparkled with a confidence that had always drawn me in. But now, standing there, she looked lost. Alone, her once perfect posture sagged under the weight of her choices, her thin smile faltering as she realized she was out of place here. She was no longer part of my life, no longer welcome in my world. Natalie took a step toward me, and for a brief second, I wondered if she would try to talk to me, but the words must have died in her throat, because she stopped, her eyes darting to Misty, then back to me. The weight of what she had done, of everything she had destroyed, seemed to finally settle on her shoulders. I watched as she turned away, slipping through the crowd and out the door, unnoticed by most, but not by me. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I let her go, and with that, the last remnants of my past life walked out with her. In the weeks that followed, I hardly thought about Natalie. It was strange at first, like a part of me that had always been there was suddenly gone, leaving behind an empty space. But it wasn't painful, it was freeing. The anger, the resentment, the betrayal, they no longer had a hold on me. They were weights I had carried for too long, and now that they were gone, I could breathe again. Misty and I moved forward quickly, not because we were rushing, but because it felt right. We'd both been through hell, betrayed by the people we thought we'd spend the rest of our lives with, but we found something real in each other. We understood each other in a way that made it easy to let the past go. There were no more lies, no more secrets, just us. One night, as we sat together on the couch, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace, I couldn't help but think back to everything that had led us here, the pain, the betrayal, the nights spent wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I had been through the darkest moments of my life, and yet, here I was happy, at peace, in love. "Penny, for your thoughts," Misty asked, nudging me gently with her shoulder. She was curled up next to me, her head resting against my chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. I smiled down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am." She looked up at me, her eyes soft and warm. "Lucky? Huh? After everything we've been through?" I nodded. "Yeah, lucky. Because I've got you." I kissed the top of her head, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. "Because we made it through." Misty smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We did, didn't we?" We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire casting a warm glow over the room. I thought about how different my life had been just a year ago, how lost I had felt. Back then, I never could have imagined this, never could have imagined feeling this content, this happy. But here I was, and here we were. I never heard much about Natalie after that night. She disappeared from our social circles, fading into the background like a bad memory. Ella continued her reckless lifestyle, dragging along whatever new friends or lovers she could find. But she and Natalie weren't seen together much anymore. Maybe the weight of what had happened was too much. Even for someone like Ella Oregon, maybe Natalie had just become another casualty of her own bad decisions. I'd like to think that Natalie regretted what she did. That, somewhere deep down, she realized the enormity of the mistake she'd made. But even if she didn't, especially if she didn't, it didn't matter anymore. Her life, her choices, her regrets. They were hers to deal with. I had my own life to live, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to it. A year later, on the anniversary of our engagement, Misty and I stood in front of the same crowd that had cheered for us on that New Year's Eve, only this time, we weren't just celebrating a proposal, we were celebrating a wedding. The ceremony was small, intimate, just close friends and family. The sun was setting as we said our vows, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, casting a soft glow over the garden. Misty looked breathtaking in her simple white dress, her eyes shimmering with happiness as she promised to love me, to stand by me, to build a life with me, and I promised the same. As we exchanged rings and sealed our promises with a kiss, I felt the last of the pain from my past lift. I had been broken, but I was whole again. Not because I had forgotten what had happened, but because I had healed, because I had found someone who saw me, who loved me, who understood what it meant to rebuild from the ashes. The reception was a blur of laughter and dancing, of champagne and toasts to the future. And when the night came to an end, Misty and I stood together, hand in hand, watching the stars glitter above us. "I love you," she whispered, leaning into me. "I love you too," I whispered back, pressing my lips to her forehead. We stood there for a while, just the two of us, savoring the quiet peace that had settled over us. And as I looked at Misty, I realized that I had finally found my home, not in a place, but in a person. And for the first time in years, I was truly, deeply happy. As for Natalie, she remained a distant memory, a chapter in my life that had long since closed. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, it didn't matter anymore. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. And now I was living in the life I had chosen. A life filled with love, trust, and peace. A life that was mine.